And great. So again, I'll turn off I won't share any of the recording after the Q&A, but we will be recording it now. So welcome everyone. I had the idea of having this webinar last week or like a week and a half ago, because I thought, you know what, there's a lot of uncertainty in the presidential race this year, and the traditional ways of forecasting might not be that relevant. And obviously in the last week and a half, it got a lot more relevant. And then on Sunday, as I was driving on the New Jersey Turnpike, my sister called me and said, "What do you think about the news?" And I'm like, "What news?" She goes, "Biden's out of the race." I thought the one time in the past week I haven't been obsessively checking Twitter was the time that he drops out of the race. So what we're going to be talking about today is, first, we're going to go into forecasting models, the 538 Economist, Nate Silver style models, talk about how not only does 2024 maybe break them now, but how were they already, in my opinion, somewhat broken even before that. Then we're going to talk about prediction markets, which are getting a lot more attention. I don't know if they are mainstream yet, but they're getting there. They might be better. And then we're going to wind up with a qualitative model that not only says who's going to win, but what are the signposts to watch out for as we get closer to election day, and then have some time for Q&A. If I don't know you, my name is Chris Oates. I'm the founder of Legislata. It is a policy information platform that's structured like social media. So if you want to track build movement in any of the 50 states and Congress, if you want to track transcripts of U.S. House committee hearings, we have all that. It's free to sign up for, and it is all the content has free trials. So definitely, please, if you work in the public policy world, sign up for that. I'll drop the link in the chat. Just give us some feedback right now. We are still at the early stage startup phase where we just really want feedback to know what to build next. Previous to this, I was working on a ballot campaign in Massachusetts on ranked choice voting that collapsed in ignominy in 2020. Before that, I was a political risk analyst for Oxford Analytica, which is not Cambridge Analytica. I now have to say that for the rest of my life. I teach political risk at Boston University. I still do some freelance work in it. My background is Oxford University, PhD. And my favorite political predictions, I don't know if these are like the most accurate, but I predicted that the Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, was going to get a challenge from his party when he gave a knighthood to Prince Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth. Everyone in my office thought I was crazy for that because they're like, it's such a dumb move. He's not going to lose his job for it. And I said, he's going to lose his job because it's a dumb move. Called the end of the U.S. government shutdown in 2013, said that Dobbs would shake up the 2022 midterms before other people did. And my favorite is that when the European Super League, which is would have been a new soccer league in Europe, came out, everyone started covering it as a sports story. And I said, nope, it is an insurgent attack against existing institutions with a lot of money at stake. It's a political story. And I said it would fail. I said it was basically a coup that failed. And that's kind of what I try to specialize in, what I teach at Boston University. Unconventional forecasting. What do we do in situations like right now where we can't just look to the historical data because maybe this thing has never happened before? So how do we deal with this right now? And what are the forecasting models telling us? So just in case you've never like dived deep into a forecasting model, the ones that were made famous by Nate Silver in 2008 are basically statistical models that try to take all of the data that we know about politics, all of the inputs that we know shape whether or not you win or lose an election, create some kind of statistical model from the historical data, and then generate lots of simulations based on current data. In those simulations, the percentage of which candidate gets above 270 electoral votes tells us the probability of which candidate we think is going to win. So Nate Silver got really famous in 2008 because he kept predicting the Democratic primary correctly. Then he predicted every state but one in the general election in 2008. He called 2012 correctly. He was, I think, the most accurate of the forecasters in 2016. And there's a couple things, though, that are the problems with his work, or not his work necessarily, but the interpretation of them. It's very easy for people to say, well, this is what the model says. Obama in 2012 has a 90% chance of winning. You round up 90 to 100, so he's going to win. And it's not that certain. It's not like we're saying this is absolutely what's going to happen. And it's also easy for people to discount it, to say, he gave Hillary Clinton a 70% chance to win in 2016. She didn't. Therefore, you can't trust anything he says. All the model is basically saying, based on historical data and historical patterns, this is what we think are the relative likelihoods to happen. Now, the Nate Silver, and I teach this in class, like there's one article that was written about him, I think the day or two before the election, that said he was the most bullish for Trump in 2016. Is there something wrong with him? And he was very clear. He's like, look, it's actually a close race. Over the last 2 weeks, Hillary's lead had shrunk, and there's the possibility of an electoral college popular vote mismatch. And he was just saying, based on historical patterns and the model that we've created, we think that that is a possibility. 30% possibility that Trump wins. So how do they do it? Well, there's kind of three big buckets that go into a lot of these models. First are polling averages. Even though polls are not 100% predictive, they're still some of the best things that we have. And what Nate Silver, I think, kind of his claim to fame was that he realized there were correlations between polls in different states. So if there's a poll in Wisconsin, that might tell you about who's likely to win Michigan because those states are similar, both geographically, but also demographically. So they look at the polls, they average them out, they try to create some sort of correlation so that a single state poll tells you about the national picture as well, or tells you about other states. And then they also blend that with what they call the fundamentals. So the economic fundamentals, which are basically the better the economy, the more likely it is that the incumbent wins, and then the political fundamentals. Incumbents tend to win. You tend to get a boost in your home state, that sort of thing. And then also they blend it with uncertainty. Much more uncertainty the further out you are, and then less, at least in the polls, the closer you get to the race. So this is before Biden dropped out. This is what some of the models said. This is from The Economist, and they said that Trump had an 83% chance of winning. And basically, they ran a ton of simulations based on the data they had. The median outcome of the simulations was that Trump had 321 electoral votes. But you can see there's a pretty wide range. So it's, in 83% of the simulations, he got 270 electoral votes. So, and before I begin, I do want to stress these models are created by really smart people, usually teams of either statisticians or political science or people with expertise in both. And I assume that they're all working in good faith. So this is not to say like the models are wrong because the modelers are wrong. I assume that the modelers are absolutely brilliant. And in most races, I would just defer to them. When people would ask me who's going to win, I'd say, well, let's just look at what Nate Silver has to say because that's his area of expertise. But I've always thought, basically since the start of the year, that 2024 might be the year to break them because these models are based on historical data. We've only had 19 presidential elections since World War II, and I think strong argument to make that even pre-1968 or 1972, that that data doesn't really apply to today. So we don't have a really large data set, and those models kind of assume that those patterns will hold. And I think 2024 had a few things going about it that were threatening to break those patterns. First, it was the polls. So we know that there are a lot of polling movement. People kind of assume that where we are now is going to be where we are in November, but we're about 100 days out. We're, I think, 105 days out. There's still going to be, on average, 8 percentage points of movement in the state polling averages. At least from 1948 to 2020, that's what happened. So we can expect that there's a lot of volatility. And the question I always had about the poll was whether or not we were seeing Trump at his ceiling and Biden at his floor for most of the year. So this is the last poll that the Economist has, again, before Biden dropped out. And you can see that there was a bounce for Trump. Post RNC, you expect to get a convention bounce, and also post assassination attempt. We don't really have a lot of data for that, but you would assume you would get a bounce. So even with that, even with almost being shot and his convention bounce, he was only 0.1 percentage points above his 2020 vote share. And you can see that for most of the year, he was bouncing around 45%, which is less than Republicans have gotten in the last 3 elections. Donald Trump got actually, a lower share of the vote than Mitt Romney did in 2012. And so it's fair to say that even with, everything going right for him, almost being shot, having your convention, having your opponent give the worst, I would say, the worst debate performance in American history, he was still polling below where he was in 2020. So I think it's a fair question of whether Donald Trump was at his ceiling and whether or not he did have much room to grow, because the story was then that most of the lead for Trump wasn't because he was stronger than 2020. It was that Biden was much weaker than 2020. He was polling about 8 points below where he was in 2020. And most of that were going to third-party candidates or just undecideds in the race. And that's why about a few months ago before the debate, I said it was still kind of a toss up. People were saying that Trump was, winning because he was leading in the polls. But I said there's a fair argument to make, and I think this was Biden's theory of the case, that Trump was leading in the polls, but there was a lot more room to grow for Biden. Trump basically had the Republican Party consolidated behind him. Biden did not have the Democratic Party consolidated behind him, and there's a decent chance that as the election gets closer, people will say, I'm going to come off the fence of undecided. I'm not going to vote for the third party candidate. I'm going to go back to kind of where I was in 2020. So again, not to say that that's correct, that Biden would have overtaken him, but just that there was a lot more uncertainty than what might have been a 4 percentage point difference in 2012, where one of the candidates is above 50%. There was a lot of volatility there, and part of that is due to RFK. He is kind of a protest vote. He is a very famous name, one of the most famous names in American political history. But if you've followed his stories about his anti-vaxxers, the fact that Jake Tapper says he won't have him on TV because he directly lied about something Jake Tapper had personal information about. He said he had a brain worm. He was on recorded maybe giving an endorsement to Trump in exchange for positions in administration. I think it's fair to say that that's not your typical third party candidate. So there, again, might be just a lot of uncertainty there that the models just aren't really built to incorporate. The other question I had about the assumptions were the economic fundamentals. So these are the variables that go into 538's economic fundamentals. And you can see most of these are pretty good for right now. Jobs are up, spending's up, the stock market is up. And this is why 538 was the model that was most bullish to Biden this whole election cycle. Just last week, they had Biden favored to win, and that's because this far out from the race, their model is heavily weighted towards the fundamentals and away from the polling. The question, though, is that there is one issue that is dominating the economic talk, which is inflation. You can see this is from an ABC News poll a couple of weeks ago. Inflation was one of the most important, or one of the single most, or very important issues for 85% of people. That is the second highest issue behind the economy, which I never really count as an issue because it's often a catch-all. But that means that inflation is absolutely dominating. And that's, I think, why Biden had been one of the reasons why he'd been struggling so much, was because that one issue was on the voters' minds. I think more than the economic fundamentals of the 538 would assume, because we don't have an instance over the last 30, 40 years where there was a spike in inflation kind of out of nowhere. And what we can see from around the world with incumbents struggling is that that spike in inflation is in many places the single most important political issue. And it's really hard for a candidate to try to overcome that. The question I have, though, is that because inflation, I think it's fair to say, is basically over, I think we have hit the soft landing, does that start to filter down into the electorate between now and November? So it could be that view of inflation in the economy is locked in, especially because prices aren't going to be dropping. And so we just have this as a drag on the Democratic ticket for the next 4 months. It could be that it starts to ameliorate and people are less worried about inflation as they get used to prices. This is, I think, probably the single biggest question politically around the world, is basically when do voters get used to a new price level? Obviously, like, hamburgers do not cost 15 cents anymore, but no one goes around saying like, oh my God, I can't believe hamburgers aren't 15 cents. Because obviously, like, what happened 60 years ago is not in our minds today, but what happened 3 years ago, 4 years ago is still in our minds. So at what point does that shift? I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows. So again, it's a question that I have for the model. And then the last thing is that this is a weird race in that we have two people who have served as president. At least we did until Biden dropped out. This is from someone that runs focus groups. She works for Democrats now. She used to be a Republican. And what she found in a lot of her focus groups were that swing voters did not like either candidate. They did not like Trump, but they didn't want to vote for Biden. That is a big question, because usually what we have is an incumbent who says, support me, we'll carry on the work that I've done. And then we have an insurgent who just says, I will do everything different and everything's going to be better. And you have that dynamic of, do you stick with what you know? Do you go with someone that's promising the sky? But what do you do in a case where people remember that Donald Trump was president, that you can point to his actual record on stuff, and Joe Biden was president, you could point to his record on stuff? And you also had, obviously, Trump is now the challenger, but Biden's message throughout much of the race was kind of a challenger style. It was, we can't let this person get back into the White House. It was somewhat of the same 2020 message. And certainly now that it's Harris, we have an instance where the quasi incumbent has never served as president, whereas the challenger has. So again, it really makes me question whether or not the political fundamental part of those models is still accurate, because this is something that is completely out of the historical data set. So what do we do if we can't trust the models? Well, one thing that we can do is look at prediction markets. Now, these are effectively a stock market where you are going to, or a futures market, you buy a contract for a particular event. If it happens, that contract is redeemed at $1. If it doesn't happen, it's redeemed at 0. So the price that you buy it at is effectively the probability. So if you buy, this is from 2008, the Democratic nomination to Hillary Clinton. If you were after she won Ohio and Texas, you may have bought a contract for Clinton winning the nomination at 30 cents on the dollar, meaning that you think, well, she just won Ohio, she just won Texas, there's maybe a 30% chance. And then you can see there was a big bump after the Reverend Wright scandal, and then it just declined over time as it became apparent that Obama had the nomination locked up. Now, um, these are really good because what they allow, and obviously basically people buy and sell, and then you get a market clearing price or whatever the latest price is. And so that's kind of what the market says the price is. The good things about this are that it allows for real-time movement. You do not need to wait for a new poll to come in to update your model. You can just look at the world, and what happened during the debate was that Biden started immediately plummeting in the prediction markets. And you look at what's happening, you're like, oh, I don't think Joe Biden is now at a 52% chance to win. I think he's much less. So I'm going to sell Biden at 52 cents, or I'm going to buy a Trump at 45 because I think his true probability is higher. So you get a lot of real-time movement. It's supposed to allow for the wisdoms of the crowds to filter out bias of individuals. So if you have a market with a pro-Trump person and a pro-Biden person, their individual biases should kind of cancel each other out. And you have a financial incentive to get it right. If you are putting down thousands of dollars in a prediction market, you have a good incentive to get it right and not just what you want to happen. The con, and I'll talk about this, we don't know who's actually in that crowd, and that could be a problem. So this is what the prediction markets have been saying about this race. They've said that Donald Trump, for most of the race, was about 50-50 early on. Then after the State of the Union and while he was on trial, he dropped below 50%, but not by much. And then started to go up as the polling came in that was better for him. After the debate, there was a spike. After the assassination attempt, there was a spike in the RNC, and he's now, according to Polymarket, about a 64% chance. Predictive, which is a different market, again, you can see slight lead, but still pretty close until the debate. And as you can see at the debate, very sharp real-time drop for Biden and a rise in Harris around the same time. And this is just, I always want to bring this up. Betting markets, prediction markets, there's a lot of people that talk about them as this new thing. They were actually a big deal in the early 1900s. From 1896 to 1936, there were betting markets in New York City on Wall Street about the presidential elections. The prices were printed in the newspaper, like the way polls are now. And they got every single election correctly. And not only did they get them correctly, but they gave a greater than 2/3 chance to the winning candidate every single election cycle. The worst they performed was Franklin Roosevelt's reelection in 1936. There's actually a really interesting story about bad polling in 1936 that I believe led to the introduction of Gallup polling and scientific polling. So there's a Reader's Digest poll about who you're going to vote for. No one took the time to think that Reader's Digest, the people that subscribe to it, were more likely to be Republican than Democratic. So it's this massive response bias. And it was after that modern polling and the Gallup organization started. But that aside, most of these prediction markets were correct, and they got the winner, at least more than a 2/3 chance, 3 or 4 months before the election in most of these cases. So betting markets, they've been around for a while, but there is some real value to them. However, there are some problems. So this year, they thought it was a toss-up. They saw some movement at the debate, but and Trump is favored. But there are some questions about, really, do these traders, like the prediction markets, like the models, do they have good historical data? If you're a trader and you're looking and you're saying, I think Trump's going to win, do you have good historical data to base that on if you're saying Trump against Harris and it's a completely new event? How are they going to incorporate early polling numbers that we know might not be that predictive? Will they go too far with that? And then finally, are the prediction markets, are the people in them representative of the electorate enough so that the bias doesn't exist? There's a really interesting academic paper looking at pricing inefficiencies in predicted after the 2020 election, where basically you could get this is who is going to win Georgia in 2020 in late November. The Democrats were only at 88%. You could get, a greater than 12% ROI on a bet when basically the thing had already happened. Like this was well after the Georgia election results were certified. And so the speculation of this researcher who looked into it is that there must have been sufficient traders on Predicted who were watching, Fox News, Newsmax, OAN, buying into the misinformation that the election still wasn't over, and were losing a lot of money because they were buying, a chance of something to happen that wasn't going to happen. So there is the chance that these prediction markets are not representative. That Predicted, we know from 2020, is not perfect, and Polymarket, because it is based on a cryptocurrency, might be a little bit too crypto pilled. And just thinking back in some other examples of prediction markets, Andrew Yang always did really well and predicted when he was running for the mayor of New York City, even though he was never really leading in the polls enough for what the markets had him. But it was because the people in the markets were pro Andrew Yang. So they're not perfect, but they are useful and they're a good complement to the forecasting models when those models again might not be at all relevant in this year. So what is an alternative approach? And one thing that I think is useful, and this is kind of where most of my work has been when we don't have a lot of polling, we don't have a lot of data that can be predictive, is to take kind of a qualitative approach and to build a model based on what we know matters for politics, and then try to, in a qualitative fashion, figure out if that variable helps Harris or Trump. So some things that we can look at are, what are the most salient issues in the election today, and are those good or bad for your party? Very rarely do you persuade voters about your position on the issue. It's more likely you just raise the salience of the issue that they already like you for. Um, can the candidate be personally insulated from the bad issues of your party? So in 2012, when Obama wanted to make the big issue about wealth inequality, Mitt Romney was not very well insulated on that. He was a very rich person who had worked at Bain Capital. It was very hard for him to say, oh, I'm not like that. I'm not that, typical Republican who supports corporations, which is what I'm being attacked on because he was Mitt Romney and had worked for Bain Capital, unlike Donald Trump in 2016, where he was able to say, I'm not like those Republicans on the issue that you don't like them for. I think Barack Obama, obviously he was insulated from issues of kind of establishment insiderdom because he was a fresh face and he was from Chicago and had only been in Washington for a few years. So, personally, does your candidate help or hurt you on the issues that you're weak? What are the economic fundamentals, relative personal favorability, the trajectory of polling, not just where polling is today, but does it look like polling is shifting in your direction so you can project it towards election day? How are you doing in campaign events now? Because again, that can project forwards to election day. The debate, and then anything state specific. And this is mostly about your vice presidential candidate. Does it look like they're giving you a little boost in a crucial swing state? So for me, what I'm looking for on issue salience is in September, is abortion and reproductive rights, or is it inflation that are the key issues? That will benefit either Trump or Harris. In terms of insulation, how does Harris respond to accusations on inflation? That she was involved in the administration when inflation spiked. Is she able to distance herself from it? Um, and similarly for Trump, he clearly does not, he knows that a national abortion ban is a political poison pill. Do voters think he's going to do it? There's been some evidence from focus groups that voters do not think Trump would do it. So does that stay, or does that accusation stick? In terms of the economic fundamentals, we're still pretty close. We're pretty close to the election now, so they're not going to change a ton. But if there's an interest rate cut, if it looks like we are in the soft landing, or if there's a spike in inflation, that could matter. Relative favorability, I'm really here looking whether to see Harris continues to track Biden's approval rating. You could definitely see a world in which they go together, or you could see a world where Biden stays at a relatively low approval rating and Harris starts to separate and shoot up. And then polling trajectory, and this is, I think, the most important one. Does Harris start to consolidate those undecided voters and the third party voters? Because again, she does not need to convert any Trump voters right now. Trump is already polling basically where he was last time or a little bit lower. So is she able to consolidate the Democratic debate? In terms of performance, just does it look like she's performing well on the stump? Does it look like Trump and Vance are performing well on the stump? And is there a debate that's going to happen? Because that's, again, a moment to shift the race. And then any state specific variables, unlikely, I think, that it'll have a huge difference everywhere, but you can definitely see, if she picks Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, and then you see, their numbers in Pennsylvania start to shoot up, that might be something to tell you Pennsylvania goes into lean Democratic. And then the roadmap I'm looking for is really July 28th, so next Monday. How much money has Harris raised in her first week? Her first 24 hours was pretty incredible, but does that continue, or was that a single spike? Because that says whether or not they can continue those fundraising numbers for the rest of August. And basically, if you have a lot of money in the bank by Labor Day, you can then make a lot of strategic moves around your ad buys. When the first polls start to come out, they're only going to be a baseline, but does it look as if her baseline is 2 points ahead of where Biden was, or is it 4 points ahead? Just to get a sense of kind of how much of an underdog she is, because I assume that she's probably going to be still trailing Trump, just because it's too early for any public opinion to really have formed about her. Um, who's the VP? I think we'll learn that probably in the next couple of weeks, and then do they start to see a bounce in their performances and in their home state? Do we actually have presidential debates? I think we'll know by the kind of the end of August, right before the convention. Does the convention produce a bounce? And then I think by Labor Day, we get back into somewhat typical political coverage, with the main difference is that for polling, we're looking more about trajectory rather than where it is right now. I don't think it matters as much where the polling is on Labor Day, as much as does it look like Harris is stuck where Biden was, and she just isn't able to get out of the shadow of inflation, or is she consolidating, getting like 1 percentage point every week, and then you project towards election day that she might have a lead. And again, do we see any scandals happening? Are the various events going? Are the debates going? And then can we tell anything about organizing efforts? Those are always really fuzzy. It's hard to know how much organizing matters at the national level. But again, that might be one variable that gets thrown in there. So bottom line, I think the prediction markets before Biden dropped out had about a 2/3 chance for Trump. The forecasting models tend to have a 3/4 of a chance for Trump. I think with the reset, it has gone back to a toss up. I don't think the forecasting models really have historical data to apply to this race, especially given the fundamental difference of an incumbent president versus an incumbent vice president. That is somewhat different, especially given that we don't have a lot of time to the election. So I kind of get back to the baseline of it's probably a toss up. But I think given that Trump might be at his ceiling in polling and Harris has plenty of space to overcome that, I'd give a slight edge to Harris, but maybe only at 55% to 45%. And that's my dog joining in. I guess he disagrees with that assessment. Okay, so now I'm gonna unmute people. If you have any questions, drop them in the chat, or you can just start talking. The one last thing I'll say, I hope you enjoyed this. Please, tell others about it. And if you do have a chance, if you do work in public policy, please check out Legislate Up. I'll drop the link in the chat again. It is completely free to join. We have a lot of great content with AI generated transcripts, everything from the federal to municipal level. But again, what we really want right now is feedback. What else could we build to help you? What content could we generate to help you? Please give it a shot, pass it around. Again, it's an early stage startup, and we really are just looking for what can we build so that for the next president, if you're working in public policy, you have the chance to have the best information possible. So if I can figure out how to let you unmute yourself, you can ask a question or start your video if you really feel like it. But I see a question: who would you recommend